Welcome back everyone to another reaction video. Well, this particular video was voted on by our patrons. All of the patrons who are at a level where they get to participate in our polls had a say in this one, and the vote was actually remarkably close, and it ended up tied. We had four choices, and I believe they came in at 28%, 28%, 23%, and 21%, so pretty divided. So of the two that were tied at 28%, I chose the winner from those two, and I've chosen Feeding the Last Tsar of Russia, pelmeni for Nicholas II. So this should be really interesting. I think Max Miller does a fantastic job of looking at history through the lens of food, which is a really fun lens through which to view history. And if you are a supporter on Patreon at any level, you have access to this video a day in advance without ads through the Patreon app. So either on the app or on the website. So you're watching this a day before everyone else. So if you want to be able to support the channel, and now more than ever, Patreon is really, 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 really important. You're going to be hearing me mention that more often moving forward, just at least for a little while, because of the importance that it has right now with everything kind of up in the air as far as YouTube's algorithm, and ad rates are way down and things like that. So everybody's hurting right now, and this is how you have an opportunity to keep the channel going. So check that out. For everyone else, you're seeing this tomorrow from when I'm recording it, and I'm actually going to be recording a bunch of stuff ahead of time. So moving forward, our patrons should get everything 24 hours in advance, ad-free through Patreon. Let's dive into this one.
Today, I'm going to be eating like Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, a man of vast power, rather incompetent leadership skills, and a surprisingly simple taste in food.
So he talks about incompetent leadership skills, and that's usually the knock on Nicholas, and a lot is made of him not really being prepared to lead when he was younger. And kind of thrust into that role. And I think that's a fair way of looking at it. I wouldn't go so far as to say incompetent, like he was an idiot who had no clue what he was doing. I would say he was more aloof and kind of clueless as to how bad things were in his country. And I don't think he was a bad person at all. I think he just was clueless and detached. And in the end, it cost not only his life, but the lives of his entire family that you see there in that picture.
Rather than the opulent French cuisine of the imperial court, he preferred traditional Russian dishes like these Siberian pelmeni, or beef dumplings.
Oh,
so thank you to Wild Grain for...
That looks fantastic. Every time I watch his videos, I'm like, I want to try making that.
Sponsoring this video as we dine like the last of the Romanovs, this time on Tasting History. Nikolai Alexandrovich Romanov, known in English as Nicholas II, was the last Russian ruler before the Russian Revolution. He took the throne in 1894 and oversaw the empire's participation in both the Russo-Japanese War and World War I, neither of which went well for Russia. This, in conjunction with his insistence on remaining an absolute autocrat, led to civil unrest, his abdication, and eventually the murder of him and his entire family in 1918. Now, when Nicholas came to power, the cuisine at the Imperial Russian court was less Russian and more French.
But that's kind of just, we still have that term that gets used, lingua franca, which is, for a long time, all of the European courts and even Russia, is kind of straddling Europe and Asia, their court language was French. And going back several generations in the Russian royal family, they had really kind of wanted to model themselves after the French. The French, for a long time, had one of the strongest autocratic monarchies in Europe, even when many of the other countries no longer did. So there was a lot to be admired for Russia admiring France.
Many of the menus were printed in French, most of the cuisine was French, most of the cooks were trained in France, and the head chef was a Frenchman named Pierre Cubat. But while the big feasts may have mostly been French food, even during the reign of Nicholas II, when they were having smaller dinners at home, just him and the family, they actually preferred to have simpler traditional Russian cuisine. Things like piroshki and pelmeni. And since I already made piroshki for the first Tsar of Russia, Ivan the Terrible, I figured I would bookend Tsarist rule by making a recipe for Siberian pelmeni from the 1861 cookbook by Elena Molokhovets Podorok Molodim Khazaikum, or A Gift to Young Housewives.
Hey, I'll give him credit. It sounds, I mean, I could be totally wrong about this, but his Russian pronunciation sounds on point.
Using a knife, scrape 1.5 pounds first quality beef from the short loin. Add 1 finely chopped and squeezed out raw onion, sieved black pepper, and salt. Use this filling to make pelmeni. If the beef is lean, use 1 pound beef and ½ pound finely chopped kidney suet. Boil the pelmeni in salted water or in bouillon in a separate saucepan. These pelmeni are best made the size of kolduni, or shaped like small ears.
That sounds delicious, and I can see why he liked it.
Siberians prepare pelmeni for several occasions at once, sprinkling them lightly with flour so they do not stick together. They are frozen and boiled in salted, boiling water as needed. Molokhovets gives this recipe for pelmeni, and right before it she gives an exact recipe on how to make the dough, with exact measurements. Very rare for this time period, so that's pretty cool. What she says is you need 1 pound or 450 grams of flour, 1 teaspoon of salt, 2 eggs, and a ½ cup or 120 milliliters of water. She actually says that you'll probably need a little bit less than that ½ cup, so we'll just keep that in mind as we make them. So start by
Which, you know, he mentions there about how historically they didn't mention exact measurements. If you are old like me, going to be 50 next year, you know that, a generation or two before us, that's kind of how they did everything. The most famous recipe that has been handed down in my family is the fudge recipe that we make, and I have yet to anywhere on the planet find fudge as good as the stuff that was in that recipe that got handed down to me. We know at the very least it goes back to my great-great-grandma, who was born in Greenup County, Kentucky. Her name was Jemima Staggs Mowry, and we know that she had that recipe and that she taught it to my great-grandmother, who was her daughter-in-law, and taught it to several other generations of the family as well. And when my grandmother made it, she didn't measure anything. She just kind of like knew, like a pinch of this and a little bit of that, and she kind of had her own way. She didn't time it. She just kind of did it all by feel, right? And I tried that and just couldn't do it. But once I figured out the exact measurements to use, I can pretty much make it flawlessly every time now.
Mixing the salt into the flour and then add the 2 eggs. Start to mix those into the dough as if you were making pasta because, well, you are making pasta. But this really isn't enough egg to fully incorporate all the flour, so add about half of the water, or a 1/4 cup, to start to make it come together as a dough. And once that's added, you can go ahead and add more water as you need. You may not need all of it. What you're looking for is a relatively dry dough. You want it to just have enough moisture that it comes together. Then once it does, you can turn it out onto the counter and begin to knead. And you need to knead it for about 10 minutes or until it's nice and smooth. It'll be about half this time if you do it in a stand mixer. After about 10 minutes of kneading it by hand, you should have a nice smooth ball of dough which you can wrap in plastic to let it rest for at least 20 minutes. Also, you can make it a day ahead and put it in the fridge if you want to, or if you make a big batch, you can actually freeze it, and then you can just take some out so you'll always have some fresh pasta dough to work with.
And that's the thing about when you're thinking about cooking for like the royal family in Russia, is the huge numbers that were being made of different kinds of food. You know, you go to a place in England like Hampton Court Palace where Henry VIII lived for a time, and you can just see the massive kitchens, and you hear the numbers of people that they were cooking for at the court on a daily basis, and it's just ridiculous. And then you go to watch a video about a U.S. aircraft carrier and the kind of food volumes that they're making there. It's nuts.
So once it's rested for 20 minutes, you can make the filling. And the filling obviously starts with meat, which she says you can scrape right off the bone and then mince. It is really hard to get it as small as it really needs to be by hand. So I'm going to go with ground beef. You need 1.5 pounds or 680 grams of it. Now she does say that this needs to be fatty or else you need to add suet. So I would go with the 20% or even 30% fat content because if you get it too lean, it just doesn't hold together.
Right. So see, typically like when I make tacos or something like that, I always get, or like if I add beef to pasta, I always get like the 93% because when you cook this has nothing to do with history. I understand. I'm diving into food mode here. but when you cook that, there's very little extra. There's not a lot of grease because it's got such low fat content, but sometimes you want that extra fat.
Then 1 teaspoon of salt, 1 teaspoon of black pepper, and 1 cup of diced onion. So just
Sounds
add
delicious.
the salt and the pepper to the meat and work it in, and then start adding the onions. Also, make sure that they're actually onions. See, halfway through, I realized that I also had some chopped onions and celery that I'm using for something else, and I grabbed that. So
Oops.
halfway through, here I am having to pick out celery from the meat, and I felt like Cinderella when she was picking out the lentils from the fireplace. Not great. Just onions. Once it's all mixed together, you can go ahead and form the pelmeni. And there are several ways to do it. You can actually roll the dough out and then cut out the pelmeni, about 3-inch wide circles. Or another way that she explains that I think is kind of easier is to divide the dough into 4 pieces and then take one piece and roll it into a little log.
Now, if you are sitting here and you're thinking, okay, enough about the food, where's the history? He always gets into that at some point, and if he doesn't, we will definitely take a deeper dive into the history with Nicholas II and the Romanov family and everything.
Make sure you cover the other pieces in plastic wrap so they don't dry out. Once you have a uniform log of dough, you want to divide that up into 10 pieces. And she is very specific about how many pelmeni this recipe will make. She says it will make 40, so that dictates the size of our pelmeni. Then kind of squeeze the dough into circles with the cut side up, and with a rolling pin, roll one of the pieces of dough out into a circle about 3 inches
Like a little
across.
pizza.
Now you don't want the dough to be too thin or they might bust when cooking. Several of mine actually did that, and it's not great. Then set about a tablespoon of the filling into the center and fold the dough over and pinch it all around to seal it. You don't need any water to make this seal, it will do it on its own. Then take the 2 ends and wrap them over each other and pinch them together. This is the traditional shape which the author says looks like an ear. Also, if your ear looks like this, go see a doctor. Then continue the process until all 40 pelmeni are made. Also, I do think these pelmeni end up being a little bigger than I would want. They're kind of 2-bite pelmeni, and I would rather have them just single bite. So if you wanted to make 60 smaller ones, you can do that.
So, just thinking about this in light of who we're talking about, which is the Romanovs and Nicholas II, I said at the top of this that one of the knocks against him historically is that he was kind of, aloof and not really connected with what his people were going through, and especially by the people was seen as very living apart and above them, right? And this sort of thing tends to show, as well as just looking at his life and his family life in general. He actually was a pretty grounded guy when it came to being a dad. There's actually selfies that he took, and he seems like he was a very loving father. And of course, it was his role as a father, and especially his wife's role, the Tsarina, as a mother, that got them into a lot of trouble because of their connection to Rasputin. So I think for all the ways in which he was definitely kind of disconnected and not really grounded in terms of understanding his people, he did seem to be more normal, more regular than most royals were at that time, just by the nature of what he's eaten, for example.
Often when you buy them frozen from the store, they're really, really small, and you could probably get 100 out of this order. Whatever size you do make them, it says to boil them in either clear bouillon or some salted water. So you can either get some clear chicken stock or something like that, or just boil some salted water and then add the pelmeni about 6 to 8 at a time and give them a stir so they don't stick to the bottom, and then let them boil until they rise to the top. This takes 3 to 5 minutes. Then continue to boil for another 3 minutes or until the meat is cooked inside. Obviously, you're going to have to take one out and test it to see if it's cooked inside, but if you end up doing it for 6 or 7 minutes at least total, it's going to be cooked. Then remove them from the pot and let them dry out just a little bit while you boil the rest of your pelmeni, and while I tell you a bit more about what it was like to dine with the last Tsar of Russia.
And by the way, if you want a little more deep dive into this topic, I think it was Netflix several years ago that did the Last Tsar documentary, the docudrama. It was really well done, I thought. Speaking of Netflix, they just added a ton of History Channel documentaries to Netflix. And if you didn't see my announcement about this, one of them is The Great War, which was the very first appearance I ever made on the History Channel. It was a 4-hour documentary about American involvement in World War I. So check that out on Netflix if you have it. It's not, I don't think, on Netflix in other countries. It's definitely on Netflix in the United States. But I believe there's another app over in, at least in the UK, that has it.
Tsar Nicholas II is one of those characters from history that is really kind of hard to figure out because he was caricatured, and so it's hard to know exactly what's true and what's not. I mean,
so in that image there, you've got, looks like Rasputin, because Rasputin is a very distinct looking, kind of crazy looking dude. And you can see those eyes. I mean, that's clearly Rasputin, and he's playing a tune, and the Tsar is dancing to it, and that's kind of the image people had of them. And I'm sure he'll get into this. If not, we'll talk a little bit more about Rasputin's connection to the royal family.
And so it's hard to know exactly what's true and what's not. I mean, it's definite that he was not a great military commander, and he was completely out of step with his people, but exactly what degree he should be demonized or lionized is a question. And I say lionized because many of his friends tried to rehabilitate his character after he died.
And I think a lot of that goes back to what I've been saying, which is that if you are the people of Russia, what you see is an autocrat, an evil dictator who was living a lavish lifestyle and led your country into a costly war, both in finances and manpower and resources, while you were starving and all this other stuff. But the people who knew him, the people that were friends and close to him, knew the man. And they didn't see him as the ruler, as the disconnected, evil dictator guy. They saw a decent human being. And I think both are true.
And maybe it's all true, but maybe it's not. It's hard to know because they were his friends. What is clear is that Nicholas II came to power at a particularly difficult moment. Russia was already ripe for revolution before he even sat on the throne, and his poor military decisions and refusal to relinquish absolute power just hastened things along.
So you see, there's a couple of things going on here. We've got Theodore Roosevelt, and he received the Nobel Peace Prize for his role in helping to bring an end to the Russo-Japanese War, which went terribly for Russia, especially their Navy. And we've done videos about the Russian Navy and the Russo-Japanese War. And you see Tsushima in particular, which was the disastrous naval battle for the Russians. Their fleet sails all the way around and then just gets lit up in Japan, or by Japan. And so that's kind of imaging all of that.
Military decisions and refusal to relinquish absolute power just hasten things along.
Right, and this is a time period you've had assassination attempts on previous czars. You've had a successful assassination on a previous czar. And think about the connections, of course, that are existing at this time. Tsar Nicholas is the first cousin and pretty much the twin of King George V of the United Kingdom. Their mothers were sisters. That's how they were related. And then Tsar Nicholas's wife was also a first cousin to King George V through George's father, because his wife was also a grandchild of Queen Victoria. And so King George V, Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany, and the Tsarina of Russia were all grandchildren of Queen Victoria. Nicholas himself and Wilhelm of Germany were a little more distantly related.
It was only after the Revolution of 1905, which was a wave of worker strikes, peasant uprisings, and military mutinies.
And this is around the time of the Russo-Japanese War.
He was forced to establish the State Duma, a legislative assembly, and granted limited rights to his people.
And that's an amazing picture if you look at that. Just consider what we're seeing there. That's absolutely incredible. But yeah, the Duma just didn't really get any real power like, say, Parliament in the UK did.
Established the State Duma, a legislative assembly, and granted limited rights to his people, which he then went on to pretty much ignore completely and undermine. So, yeah. Basically, at the heart of the issue was that he was just unwilling to give up the tradition of complete autocratic rule that Russia had had for the last 300 years.
And you see there, I think that's Tsar, is that Alexander the Third. I think he's the one that was assassinated by a bomb. And you had this going on for the better part of 100+ years. You'd had this unrest going on, and this is one of the ways in which Nicholas is very disconnected, is that he's not really reading the tea leaves, or at least the people who are surrounding him are insulating him from how bad things are.
Most of Europe was beginning to modernize, and
Right.
he just was not interested. And to say he was out of touch would be a massive understatement. But by many accounts, it wasn't that he was being malicious,
Right.
it was more that he was just completely oblivious to what was going on outside of his palace most of the time.
I'm glad Max said that, because that tells me that Max understands this situation. That's exactly how I would describe it.
And it's interesting because he did try to make an effort to kind of be one of the people, and one of the ways he did that was in how he ate. When he would visit his soldiers during World War I, he would eat the same porridge, rye bread, and shui, or cabbage soup, that his soldiers did.
It's just too bad he wasn't a better military commander, or that he didn't relinquish power more readily to people who were more competent.
Even at home, his daily breakfast was simply rye bread with butter, some boiled eggs, and ham. Lunch was often boiled beets and potatoes with slices of roast pork and horseradish. And one of his wife's ladies-in-waiting recalled the sovereign preferred simple dishes, simple roasts and chicken. In general, he either liked to eat alone or with his wife, the Tsarina Alexandra Feodorovna. And she too had simple tastes when it came to food.
And see, I just look at him, and I know it's hard to be sympathetic to a person in his position, considering everything that was going on in Russia at that time. But there's something. You ever heard somebody described as having kind eyes? I've always felt like he had very kind eyes, and I look at the pictures, and especially the picture of his family, and I feel nothing but sympathy for what ended up happening to them. I really do.
For most of her adult life, she was all but vegetarian, rarely eating any meat or fish, and instead preferred vegetables, eggs, cheese, and butter. But like me, she had a weakness for all things sweet and baked. In fact, the head baker at the palace once recalled that they prepared plenty of superb cookies, small, the size of a little kopeck coin, kalachas, milky Kaiser rolls, amazing puff pastry buns, and twisted salty loaves. It was probably her love of baked goods that led her to occasionally complain about how they did afternoon tea at the Russian court, because even though she was the Tsarina, or Empress of Russia, she was not born in Russia, but rather
German.
in Darmstadt,
Yep.
Germany. Then she spent much of her formative years actually living in England with her grandmother, Queen Victoria. So she...
Yeah, and this was pretty common. I mean, there's so many German ties to the British royal family, to the Russian royal family, and that goes back generations. I mean, Catherine the Great was born in Germany. She was born German.
was used to the grand afternoon teas which had become popular there in the latter half of the 19th century. Russia, on the other hand, doesn't seem to have got the memo about the fancy afternoon tea, and so, according to her friend, Alexandra would often complain that tea was a meal in which there was never the slightest variation. Always appeared the same little white-draped table with its silver service, the glasses in their silver standards, and for the rest, simply plates of hot bread and butter and a few English
Sounds
biscuits.
delicious.
Never anything new, never any surprises in the way of cakes or sweet meats. The Empress often used gently to complain, saying that other people had much more interesting teas. But she, who was supposed to have almost unlimited power, was in reality quite unable to change a single detail of the routine of the Russian court.
Oh, such a terrible problem to have. But I get that. I get why she would whine about that.
And she says this actually kind of went for everything. They used the same incense that they had for hundreds of years. The same furniture was there for the last 2 centuries.
This actually is an interesting insight because it shows just how unwilling to change this institution was, and that in the end was their downfall.
The same outfits for the messengers that they had been wearing since the early 18th century. For all I know, the same plates for hot bread and butter on the same tea table were traditions going back to Catherine the Great, or Peter, or farther still, perhaps. And I love this little anecdote because on the face of it, it's all about how the imperial family used to have tea and would never change anything. Haha, simple enough. But it is a bit of a microcosm and metaphor for how they also lived all of their life and the political situation in Russia. A complete inability to change tradition, even if better alternatives came along, even if everyone around them wanted to change, they refused to change at all.
And this is a great lesson for life, isn't it? But it's also a great point about how I harp on this topic of this idea of looking at history through different lenses. And here's a great example of how looking at history through the lens of food gives you a picture of a much bigger historical concept. The Russian monarchy's inability to change. If you couldn't change things as simple as uniforms and tea, how are you going to change a system of government?
And when it came to tea, this simply ended in the Tsarina being rather irked. When it came to politics, this led to the entire family being killed.
Yep.
Now, while tea and breakfast and lunch and really any meal where it was just the family remained relatively simple affairs, many meals had to have invited guests.
Yeah.
And so tradition came along with that. Menus from those lunches and dinners, which often had a dozen or even 100 guests, shows a cuisine that you would expect when visiting a palace.
And this is where you start to lose me, because I'm a pretty simple guy when it comes to my food tastes. I tend to eat the same things at different restaurants that I go to and don't really get out of my own comfort zone very often. When I start seeing the menus at some of these lavish state dinners, it's like, nah, give me a McDonald's hamburger, I'm good.
Lunch at the Lvadya Summer Palace in Crimea began with a soup with small vol au vent, savory pastries, and small cheese toasts. Importantly, vol au vent were served together with the soup rather than as
French.
a separate dish, as they are abroad. The soup was followed by fish, a chicken casserole, vegetables, sweets, fruit. To drink, there were Madeira, white and red wines for breakfast, or beer as an option, and different wines served at lunch, as is the custom everywhere else in the civilized world.
As is the wines served at lunch, as is the custom everywhere else in the civilized world, because we know that your working class Irishman was having a different wine served at lunch every day right now. I mean, obviously, again, this is a very unique view of what the rest of the world was doing.
And liqueurs and coffee. Lunch on the Standard, the imperial yacht, were similar affairs, if a little less elaborate.
On the Black Sea,
Menus from these meals include cream soups, small hand pies or piroshki, salmon mayonnaise, filet of beef, lobster, wild goat or venison, pears and sherry, peaches glacé, and lingonberry pie.
One thing I'll say, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, one of the things you get with Nicholas II and his family that you don't often get with many of the royal families at this point are these more candid photos. You know, just them sitting, enjoying food together around a table just as a family, out having a picnic somewhere. You don't see that many of those comparatively of other royal families.
But again, many of these meals would have guests who would also feast on copious amounts of caviar, something that actually Nicholas himself did not care for. One of the officers on the royal yacht recalled that the sovereign really liked appetizers apart from caviar, Atlantic salmon, and salted fish overall. Supposedly, he actually liked those things when he was younger, but on a trip that he took from the east through Siberia, he took a train, and at every single station he would be greeted with fanfare and gifts of salted fish and caviar, which he ate and got sick of, and just after that trip never wanted it again.
Any of you have that? I'd love to hear it in the comments. Do you have something in your life that because you overindulged on it, now to this day you're sick of it? For me, and I may have shared this story in a video before, but I used to love Cool Whip on my pumpkin pie for Thanksgiving. One year, I think I was probably 8 or 9 years old, I ate like an entire bowl just of Cool Whip. And to this day, 40 years later, it makes me start to want to vomit just to even look at a bowl of Cool Whip. That's how disgusted I am because of an incident 40 years ago in my life.
Now, when they weren't at their summer home in Crimea or gallivanting on their yacht, Nicholas and his
See, this is what I mean. Just look at all these just pictures of him sitting around with his family. There's so many of them. And why does that look like a little stand with somebody's cell phone attached to it there.
They preferred the Alexander Palace outside of St. Petersburg over any of their other palaces. What's interesting is that while it is a smaller palace in comparison with something like the Grand Catherine Palace, it's still a palace, and so you would expect there to be at least one room dedicated as a dining room. But there wasn't.
Really?
There was no single room meant to eat in. So just depending on the meal, they would eat all over the place. If the couple were dining alone, they would usually eat in the Empress's reception room. For family dinners, it was the rosewood-paneled palisander drawing room. Then, if they were having a larger affair, say 30 to 100 people, they would open up the semicircular hall. Though if they had a bigger group, anything over 100, they would actually have to go to a different palace just because there wasn't any space in the small, petite Alexander Palace to host that many people.
We're going to have to go to the bigger palace, folks. Can't seat 100 in this one.
But when they were having big dinner at the semicircular hall of the Alexander Palace, they had two ways of setting up the tables. One was to have round tables that could hold 10 or 11 people. This allowed for more conversation, and it was how they would set it up if the Tsar actually liked the people that were eating, because he would go from table to table with each course so that he could talk to everyone and so that everyone could say that they had had dinner with the Tsar. If he didn't really like the people that were there, or if it was a more formal affair, then they would set up a massive U-shaped table that he would sit at one end of and only then have to talk to the people on either side of him. These dinners were the kinds of dinners with a lot of the fancy French food that Nicky, which is what they called him, didn't really care for. So
yeah, there's references in history to the Willie Nicky telegrams right at the outset of World War I, when Tsar Nicholas II and Kaiser Wilhelm II are trying to hash out something behind the scenes before it leads to war. And they did. They referred to themselves as Willie and Nicky.
He would actually fill up usually on the hors d'oeuvres, which were kept in a separate room. The hors d'oeuvres were brought out and put on a banquet table or a buffet, and then everybody would eat standing up while they would drink some vodka. Only after a couple shots of vodka would they go into the main hall for dinner. That is when the hot food would come out. And I say hot food with air quotes because it was notorious for always kind of being cold, because the kitchens were rather far away from the palace. When they were made back in the 1790s, they were made far away, one, so that the noise and the odors wouldn't make it into the palace, and also to protect the palace from fire.
Right, and even in people's homes, like in the backwoods of Kentucky, where my family came from, they would very often have like a summer kitchen that was separate in a little building that was away from the rest of the house, because it was already super hot in the house as it was, and you didn't need to deal with all of that.
So the food, though, would have to go on a trolley for over 500 feet outside before it got to the palace, no matter what time of year. And St. Petersburg can get pretty cold, and so did the food.
Yeah.
It wasn't until 1902 that they finally built an underground tunnel.
Oh, wow.
It was still a long way to go, but
we need a tunnel just so we can transport the food. That's awesome.
Now the food would arrive lukewarm. Those serving this lukewarm food were the footmen, and they were chosen from the ranks of the imperial army, and they were chosen because of their height and their bearing and their handsomeness. So you had a bunch of tall, good-looking, kind of overbearing waiters behind you.
It's no different than, somewhere like Hooters picking a bunch of very attractive, very voluptuous women. I'm not praising it. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that there's a long history of people wanting to choose a particular kind of individual to be the one who presents the food when you're trying to make a specific impression to your guests.
And you never knew if they were there, because while they dressed in white tie and wore white gloves, they also wore these soft black shoes that basically let them sneak around unheard, which made it so that they knew all of the gossip, because people would just talk like they weren't even there. One guest recalled that every time we were at the palace, we had lunch or dinner there, and the footmen would whisper to us bits of news from the scandalous chronicle of the place, whether we cared for it or not. They knew everything.
And this is why you often, in many many of the monarchies only had very trusted people who were that close to things that could be trusted. Today we would call those people with code word clearance.
Being one of those footmen was a bit of a place of honor, so people held on to the position as long as they could, and basically the more senior you were, the better position you got. So the Tsar's footman was also the oldest one there. He had actually been his father's footman, and he was so old that he was going blind and had trouble holding things, so the Tsar would often have to hold his arm while he poured the wine.
There's a lot of monarchs who would never have done such a thing, who would have demanded that person be changed, who would have thought that was beneath them to help them hold the wine. I just don't see Nicholas as that kind of guy that worries about such frivolous things.
And we're also involved in the ceremony of toasts that would take place at every large banquet. At all the great banquets, a court official stood behind the chair of every royal guest to hand the champagne for the toasts. This was a matter of solemn ritual. The wine was first poured out by a footman, then it had to be passed to a page, who in turn passed it to
all these
hander.
Traditions.
These handers also were a prestigious position and also were held by the oldest people who were working there, and so some of them had trouble actually doing their job. Prince Christopher of Greece once recalled that I can still remember my sister's distress when her favorite pale blue velvet court dress turned a vivid green in patches after her hander had spilt 6 glasses of champagne over
Wow.
it. But provided you didn't get champagne all over you, it was time to eat. And the meal usually started out with a consommé, this is after the hors d'oeuvres, a consommé at the table, and then very often another soup, something heavier like a cream soup that would be served with piroshki. Then came the Yaroslavl-style grouse, or the famed steamed kachina trout, which came from the Partitsa stream that ran through the imperial estates south of St. Petersburg. Then a saddle of wild goat, chicken fillet with truffles, or cold lobster, roast duck, a salad, artichokes with mushrooms.
This is what I mean about these big state dinners, man. Forget it. Not my thing.
Asparagus. And then there were sweets like soufflés, baked apples, fritters, puddings, and
Now we're talking.
Then a course of ice cream, followed by another course simply titled dessert, which was usually an assortment of fresh fruit, berries, and light cakes. The ice cream course was actually a particular specialty of the Russian court. Nicholas ate a lot of ice cream. Alexandria, his wife, also did. And Maria, who was the daughter of Grigory Rasputin, even called it out in her memoir.
Interesting.
I remember ice cream, the like of which I have never eaten anywhere else. And what was interesting to many people was that the courses were served à la Russe, or in the Russian manner, as opposed to à la Française, which had been the traditional way of serving food in most of Europe for several centuries.
So we've done some videos on Rasputin, so I'm not going to dive into that topic too much. It's not really what the focus is here. But I'll throw on the end screen one of those videos that you can take a look at, and we can dive a little bit more into the topic of what was happening and what his connection was to the royal family.
À la Française is where all of the dishes are laid out on a table and people serve themselves, while à la Russe is where dishes are portioned in the kitchen, then brought out sequentially. This is how pretty much every restaurant today serves food. Also, it made it so that the Tsar actually had to eat rather slowly on purpose, because he would be served first and he would start eating. And then it would go down the line by order of importance and everyone else would be served. But the moment that he stopped eating and put down his silverware, the plates would be taken away. Not just his, but everyone's.
Wow.
So if you were at the end of the line, you better eat really quick or else you're just going to get a couple bites and then whoop, on to the next course. As for the wines, red and whites were served with every course, but by most accounts, the Tsar himself was not a big drinker, which is in contrast with how the Bolshevik propaganda portrayed him, which often portrayed him as a degenerate drunk. By most accounts, he actually didn't drink that much, and when he did, it was usually port or sometimes Madeira, and then later on in life, it would be a wine that was from the Crimea.
And it was probably a social thing where he drank at occasions where it was expected that one would drink.
personal security chief wrote that he only drank port at table. Since the Japanese war, the Tsar had given up spirits. It was only when he traveled by sea that he would take, and very rarely at that, 1 or 2 small glasses of vodka before dinner. And even when he did drink something like port, he did so in moderation. The emperor was seated in the place of honor. Before him was a bottle of a special port, the gift of the King of England, and a small golden goblet. He never drank more than 1 goblet of this wine, and never tasted any other. Again, this is coming from someone who was a friend of his, so it's unclear exactly how little or how much he drank.
I don't see any reason why someone would need to lie about something like that. You know, you could say, yeah, he liked wine and he often had several glasses, and I don't think that saying something like that would tarnish his image in any way or reflect negatively on him. So I don't think they would need to lie and say, oh, he didn't drink that much. He only had like 1 glass.
Kind of something that we have to take with a grain of salt. Now, after the meal, it was time for coffee and a cigarette. And he would make a point to announce that the Tsarina had said that it was okay for him to have a cigarette. And then
and again, look at these candid photos. You just don't see those that often of historic figures.
Once he did, then everybody else would also light up and have a smoke. Now, these kinds of meals would, in 1917, come to an end after the Tsar abdicated his throne, was forced to abdicate, but culinary standards were maintained even if the guest count went down because they were essentially under house arrest at the Alexander Palace. One menu from October of that year, after they had been moved to Tobolsk, shows the family dining on borscht, piroshki, roast grouse, salad, and fruit compote. Then in June of 1918, just 1 month before the family's death in Yekaterinburg, the Tsar actually wrote in his diary, "Since yesterday, Kharitonov has been preparing our food. The provisions are delivered every 2 days. The daughters are learning how to cook from him. They prepare the flour and knead in the evening and bake the bread in the morning. Not bad at all."
See, oh man, this is such a fascinating thing. Just weeks before their death, I mean, they really did not have a clue that they were about to die. Even up until the minutes before they were killed, they were being told that they were going to have a photograph taken before they were moved. And they were really just killed because the people who had control of them thought that they were about to lose control of them and figured they needed to eliminate them before they fell back into hands that might protect them.
In the Romanovs' last days, their diet switched to that of a basic soldier's ration, but it was said that they never complained. Basic cabbage soup and bread or potatoes is what they ate until the entire family, Nicholas, Alexandra, and their 5 children, were murdered by Bolshevik revolutionaries on July 17, 1918. It was the end of the Romanov dynasty and the end of Imperial Russia, and they were demonized. Now, exactly to what level is really hard to know.
And, you know, it was only, I guess in my lifetime, probably I was a teenager when they uncovered the bodies in Ekaterinburg and took some time to identify them. And they didn't necessarily have all of them at first, but they've eventually identified all of them. And it was actually Prince Philip, who was Queen Elizabeth II's husband, to be the father of the current King Charles III. It was his DNA because he shared mitochondrial DNA with them. They used his DNA to help identify the bodies.
And it's not the point of this channel for me to dive into that. But what I do really appreciate is that in the years after, friends and people who worked for them did write to try to give a bit of a glimpse at the behind-the-scenes family life of the Romanovs.
And isn't that all any of us can ask, right? Is that when we're gone and can no longer defend ourselves, especially if you're somebody who has been in the public eye to some degree, which inevitably invites scrutiny, and when you're in the middle of politics, people are going to demonize you, that the people who knew you best, the people who knew and loved you, who spent time with you, rise to your defense and say, no, let me tell you what it was really like being around this person. That's all any of us can ask for.
And as someone who, studies food history, I really, really appreciate that, because we learn things like the Tsar of Russia, who was one of the most powerful people in the world, and did, enjoy his opulent wealth and lifestyle, also preferred the very simple
Yeah.
dishes on his table. Things
I think that's awesome.
like these pelmeni, which I am about to eat right now.
Oh,
Except
I bet those are good.
before I do, I need to address something, because the recipe that I'm using says to boil them, and then it actually says to serve them as a soup, which is common. But it was known that the Tsar, when he was on the royal yacht, actually preferred to eat them boiled and then fried in a pan, and he would eat them straight from the pan. So I'm going to pan fry these.
Nice.
So melt some butter or ghee in a pan and then toss a few of the boiled pelmeni in and let them cook for about a minute on each side, just making sure that they don't stick. And then they are ready to be served with smetana or sour cream and a bit of dill. And here we are, Siberian pelmeni, fit for the last Tsar of Russia. So like I said, they are a little bit bigger than I think I would like. This is how big she says to make them, but it's going to be hard to eat this in one bite. I think one bite is the ideal size. Anyway, a little sour cream or smetana on there, and we'll take a bite. Oh, that's really good.
Yeah, I might have to try that.
Oh my gosh.
So one of the things that we've added as a new perk on Patreon is that I'm doing these little snippets, like these little 1, 2, 3 minute videos. And then also once a week, I'm going to be doing this long, like 5 to 10 minute video, giving like behind the scenes looks at different things. That might be a good opportunity to try and make some of this stuff.
Good. So as you may have noticed, a little bit of the meat fell out, and that's because they are too big to do in one bite, or at least one decent bite. Maybe if I was alone in a dark room, just scarfing these. But on camera or in polite society, these are 2-bite pelmeni. But you can see the meat in there. The dough kind of puffs up a little bit around it. So, no, it's so good though. One second.
Gosh, yeah, I'm gonna try that.
I mean, I don't think I've ever met a dumpling I didn't like, but these are really, really good. Especially because they are so simple. It's just really the meat and onions with a little salt and pepper. All
right, as always, that was fantastic. I learned some really cool stuff there, and it gave us a chance to talk about not only food but history. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I do, seeing videos like that. I want to thank Alex Arnston and Graham Knight for your support on Patreon. And if you want to be able to see these videos a day in advance, sign up on Patreon. Just read through the different tiers and you'll see what you get at each one as far as the perks go with those levels. And your support honestly is the only thing keeping this channel going right now. So thank you so much for that. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.